The 1970s Chevrolet C20 wasn't just a pickup truck. It was a workhorse that accidentally became a legend. This was the truck hauling bricks by day, towing race cars by night, and somehow still ending up in driveways as a family vehicle on weekends. But here's the shocking part. Most people think they know the C20, yet they've only scratched the surface. Because hidden beneath that square-jawed steel body is a story of raw torque, strange design decisions, overlooked innovations, and some downright wild factory options that would never survive today's regulations. And just when you think it's just another old Chevy truck, you'll realize why the C20 quietly shaped how modern heavy-duty pickups exist today. Before we dig into the secrets Chevy didn't advertise back then, smash that subscribe button like you're slamming the tailgate of a fully loaded C20 after hauling a ton of gravel, because this story only gets heavier from here. And trust me, what made this truck truly different is something most owners didn't even notice at first. But we're getting to that very soon. Here's something most people never stop to question. What exactly was the Chevrolet C20 supposed to be? It wasn't a light-duty pickup like the C10, and it wasn't a full commercial brute like today's 2500 HD. The C20 lived in a strange middle ground, heavy-duty without trying to look intimidating. In the 1970s, Chevy designed the C20 for people who worked hard but still wanted comfort. Farmers, contractors, towing enthusiasts. Even families who thought, yeah, we'll just use the truck for everything. And Chevy leaned into that idea hard. You could spec a C20 with carpeted interiors, wood-grain trim, air conditioning and power steering, luxuries that felt almost rebellious for a heavy-duty truck at the time. This wasn't just about work anymore. This was Chevy testing the idea that a truck could be both tough and livable. But here's where it gets interesting. This identity split would later influence how Silverado trims are designed today. Work truck versus LT versus high country? The C20 planted that seed decades ago. And that dual personality leads us directly to something even more surprising. The mechanical choices Chevy made under the hood. If fuel economy mattered to you in the 1970s, the C20 politely ignored your feelings. This truck was built during an era when torque mattered more than efficiency, and Chevrolet offered engines that felt like they were carved from solid iron. Because, well, they basically were. The most common power plants ranged from inline-six engines to big block V8s, including the legendary 454 cubic-inch V8. This wasn't an engine, it was a statement. The goal wasn't speed, it wasn't refinement, it was pulling power. The C20 was designed to tow heavy trailers, carry serious payloads, and do it repeatedly without overheating or complaining. These engines were understressed, overbuilt, and hilariously durable. Some of them ran for decades with minimal maintenance, which explains why you still see C20s working today, often with engines that have never been rebuilt. Of course, the downside? Let's just say fuel stations knew this truck on a first-name basis. But here's the wild part. Chevy intentionally detuned some engines for longevity rather than peak horsepower. That decision made the C20 slower, but nearly unstoppable. And that toughness didn't stop at the engine. Because what Chevy did with the suspension is something almost nobody talks about. Let's be honest for a second. If you've ever ridden in an unloaded 1970s Chevrolet C20, you remember it. That ride was not soft, it was not gentle, and it definitely wasn't apologizing. The C20 used heavy-duty leaf springs designed to handle serious weight. When the bed was empty, those springs made every bump feel personal. Passengers would bounce, coffee would spill, and someone in the cabin would eventually say, "Is this thing supposed to ride like this?" Yes. Yes, it was. But once you loaded it up, bricks, equipment, trailers, that suspension transformed. The C20 suddenly felt planted, stable, and confident. It was happiest when it was working, not cruising empty. This setup revealed Chevy's philosophy at the time. Comfort was optional. Capability was mandatory. And here's a funny truth. Many owners planned to upgrade at some point and just never did, because every time they thought about selling it, the truck would fire up and remind them why it stayed. And this leads us to one of the most overlooked features of the C20. Something that quietly separated it from the C10 in a big way. Here's a secret most casual fans miss. The Chevrolet C20 didn't just look tougher than the C10, it was tougher, especially underneath. The real magic lived in the rear axle and frame construction. Chevy equipped the C20 with heavier axles designed to handle higher payloads and towing forces without flexing or failing. These axles were built with long-term abuse in mind, not weekend use. And that meant something important. The C20 could tow loads that made smaller trucks feel nervous. Boat trailers, car haulers, equipment trailers. This truck didn't flinch. Even more interesting? Many of these axles were so overbuilt that modern restorers still use them for performance builds today. That's right, the C20 accidentally became a donor truck for hot rods and custom builds decades later. But capability alone doesn't explain why the C20 still has such a cult following. The real emotional connection comes from something else entirely. Ask C20 owners one simple question. Why do you still have it? The answers rarely involve specs. They'll talk about memories, about learning to drive in it, about hauling with their parents, about the sound of that V8 starting on cold mornings. The 1970s Chevrolet C20 became a family artifact, not just a vehicle. It stayed around because it refused to quit, and because replacing it felt wrong. That emotional durability is rare, and it's part of why values have started climbing in recent years. But there's one last twist in this story. Something that truly explains why the C20 still matters today. Modern heavy-duty pickups didn't appear overnight. They evolved. And the 1970s Chevrolet C20 was one of the stepping stones that proved people wanted strength without sacrificing usability. It showed manufacturers that trucks could be tools, daily drivers, and long-term investments all at once. The C20 influenced how we think about towing ratings, durability, and trim levels. It normalized the idea that a pickup could be part of everyday life, not just the job site. And maybe that's the biggest shock of all. This truck wasn't loud about its impact. It didn't chase trends. It simply worked, and kept working. Which brings us to the perfect ending. The 1970s Chevrolet C20 isn't remembered because it was flashy. It's remembered because it earned its reputation one load at a time. It was honest, overbuilt, sometimes uncomfortable, often thirsty, but always dependable. And in a world where vehicles are becoming more complex and disposable, that kind of simplicity feels almost rebellious today. The C20 didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to last. And somehow, it still does. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Chevrolet's most underrated legends, you're already in the right place. because Tech Lab is where real automotive stories live. And this was just one of them.